This is Rummy's Corner. What if George Foreman versus Larry Holmes? This is the debut edition of the Dream Fight series, and a hypothetical fantasy matchup between Big George and the Easton assassin is one that actually has an interesting backstory. The 1970s is widely viewed as the greatest decade in heavyweight boxing history. It's in fact sometimes referred to as the golden age of heavyweight boxing. The 1990s was another stellar decade that is known as an exceptional period in heavyweight history. In that context, one might refer to the 90s as the Silver Age. Amazingly, Foreman and Holmes were each elite-level heavyweights during various points in both the 1970s and the 1990s. And yet, for various reasons, the fight never happened. The closest it came to becoming a reality was when Foreman would have been 50 and Holmes 49, in a bout that would be billed as Battle of the Aged. Foreman and Holmes had agreed to square off on January 23, 1999. Foreman was to receive $10 million, Holmes was slated to earn $4 million, and each fighter received a non-refundable down payment equaling 10% of their respective guarantees. But the promoter missed the deadline to fulfill his financial obligations, and after trying to reschedule for March 27th, the remaining money never materialized and the fight was off. The question of why these two never squared off earlier, despite being high-level heavyweight operators over a span of 5 years in the 70s and another 7 years in the 90s, totaling an even dozen years where their careers overlapped, the main reason these two never met primarily boils down to timing. When Big George defeated Smokin' Joe Frazier in devastating fashion in January 1973 to become the new undisputed heavyweight world champion, Holmes hadn't even officially begun his professional career. And by the time Holmes got his first title shot, when he defeated Ken Norton to become the new WBC heavyweight champion, Foreman had already been retired for more than a year. So the stars were simply never aligned for this matchup to come together during the Golden Age. When Foreman made his comeback in 1987, Holmes was then retired. Although Larry was lured out of retirement in 1988 when he unsuccessfully challenged Iron Mike Tyson for the undisputed crown. After losing to Tyson, Holmes again retired, as Foreman continued his improbable comeback, which against all odds actually started gaining a little steam. Perhaps inspired by the success of Foreman, Holmes made a comeback of his own in 1991. And again, for whatever reason, the timing was never quite right for them to fight in the 90s, where they were both on different paths with the same end goal in mind. A shot at the heavyweight championship. When you look at the careers of Big George and the Easton assassin, we have 4 famous examples of common opponents: Gentleman Jerry Cooney, Evander Real Deal Holyfield, Ken Norton, and the greatest himself, Muhammad Ali. But these common opponents tell us almost nothing about how a dream fight between Holmes and Foreman might unfold. Foreman stopped Ken Norton in 2 rounds in March 1974. Holmes beat him by a 15-round split decision in June 1978. A lot happened in those 4 years in between, when Larry was on the rise and George was out of boxing. You had 2 boxers whose careers were moving in opposite directions. Foreman lost to Muhammad Ali by 8th round KO in October 1974. Holmes beat Ali by 10th round stoppage in October 1980. But these were 2 very different versions of Ali. Foreman faced a crafty and still very formidable 32-year-old Ali, and Holmes faced a 38-year-old Ali who had clearly slipped tremendously and was a shell of his former self. Holmes defeated Jerry Cooney by 13th round stoppage in June 1982, when Cooney was a top-rated undefeated contender. Foreman defeated Cooney by 2nd round knockout in January 1990, and Jerry was basically a part-time boxer at that point, having only fought 4 times in the previous 8 years since losing against Larry. The most relevant common opponent, at least in terms of what may have happened in the early 90s, is probably Holyfield. Foreman lost a 12-round unanimous decision against Holyfield in April 1991, and Holmes lost a 12-round unanimous decision against Holyfield in June 1992. But even the Holyfield matches don't tell us a whole lot, other than maybe a fight between Foreman and Holmes at that time would have likely been a very competitive showdown. In any situation, I'm not big on triangle theories in any case. Styles make fights. But sometimes a common opponent might provide some clues or insight into what may have happened. I do not believe that is the case here, at all. Holmes and Foreman both had high points during their respective second careers. In February 1992, Larry won a 12-round unanimous decision against merciless Ray Mercer. 42-year-old Larry Holmes outboxed, out-hustled, and outsmarted the 30-year-old undefeated contender, and this earned Holmes his title shot against Evander. In November 1994, George scored a 10th-round knockout against undefeated heavyweight champion Michael Moore. Foreman was 45 going on 46, and he stopped the undefeated 26-year-old heavyweight world champion. These were both spectacular victories. Obviously, Foreman had regained the heavyweight crown more than 20 years after he had lost it against Ali, so that is clearly the bigger achievement. He likewise had become the oldest heavyweight champion in history, a record that stands to this day. But all the same, Holmes arguably may have actually looked more impressive overall in his gritty win against Mercer. If Big George and the Easton Assassin ever met at any point in their respective careers, I think the fans would likely get a fun and entertaining competitive showdown. During their overlapping years from 1973 to 77, I tend to believe you have to give Big George the edge. Foreman was physically in his prime fighting years, he was competing at the elite level, and he was a wrecking machine. Holmes, on the other hand, was still fine-tuning his craft and working his way up, gaining valuable experience points as a sparring partner along the way. By the time Foreman retired in 1977, Larry was just hitting his elite-level stride. So if George had hung around after his loss against Jimmy Young, I think Holmes would have been a clear favorite in the late 70s. But that's irrelevant because Foreman was out of boxing. They did have one overlapping year in the 1980s, 1988. Personally, I would confidently take the Holmes who lost against Mike Tyson over the Foreman who was fighting Tom Trim and Guido Train around the same time. Even though Foreman was active and Holmes had been out of the ring for 2 years, Foreman was still working his way back into fighting shape. He was facing overmatched opponents, but he was staying busy and fighting regularly to work his way back into form. Holmes was coming off back-to-back losses against Michael Spinks, but both of those losses were at least somewhat controversial, particularly their rematch. Even though Foreman was actively competing, I think Larry accumulated less ring rust than George had shaken off by that point in time. During their overlapping years in the 1990s, I tend to think it's a 50-50 pick'em fight with very little separating the two in terms of ability. They both ran a little hot and cold during the 90s, but I believe this matchup would have had both heavyweights highly motivated and bringing their A games. If they had fought 3 times throughout the 90s, I wouldn't be surprised if it ended with each guy getting a win, a loss, and a draw. But the more interesting way for me to think about a dream fight between Foreman and Holmes is to consider what would have happened if they battled when each man was at his best. Who wins between the best versions of George Foreman and Larry Holmes? 15 rounds of hypothetical heavyweight action. For me, the best version of George Foreman is from 1973-74, when he was making quick work of elite-level operators like Smokin' Joe Frazier and Kenny Norton. And I think the best version of Holmes probably falls somewhere in the range of 1980 through 82. From the time he beat Ali until the time he was beating guys like Gentleman Jerry Cooney and Randall Tex Cobb, Holmes was really firing on all cylinders during that stretch. Prime Foreman was a lean, mean KO machine. He was extremely tough. He had incredible power in both hands. He could throw a wide variety of punches, and he was able to find ways to deliver that power in devastating fashion. Foreman had the mentality of an invincible, undefeated world champion, and he had the menacing punching power to back it up. This version of Foreman is capable of knocking out any heavyweight in history, including the great Larry Holmes. That doesn't mean he would knock everyone out, but he certainly had the destructive power to put a hurting on anyone. In my eyes, this is Foreman's best chance against Larry. He needs to get to him early, even if he got to him and wound up not stopping him. At the very least, Foreman wants to earn Larry's respect and make Larry reluctant to do what Larry does best, which is box and scrap where he controls the distance. A best case scenario for Foreman is an early stoppage, but short of that, Big George wants to hurt Larry and prevent him from establishing a rhythm at range. Prime Holmes was a smooth operator. He had an extremely high ring IQ. He excelled at dictating the fighting range and tempo, and he had arguably the greatest jab in the long, rich history of heavyweight boxing. Holmes also had the mentality of an undefeated world champion, and he had the skills and smarts to back it up. Holmes also had an elite-level chin, and just as importantly, he had excellent recuperative powers. Holmes famously rose from the canvas after being dropped by the fearsome punching power of Ernie Shavers, and Holmes always showed tremendous heart and courage in the face of adversity. A best case scenario for Holmes is to control the range with his jab where he outboxes Foreman in a defensively responsible manner. Short of that, Holmes wants to minimize any incoming damage, use his ample bag of tricks to overcome any shaky moments, and try to drag Foreman into deep waters where he can finish stronger in the later rounds of the contest. Larry Holmes was only stopped once in 75 professional contests, and that one stoppage loss was against prime Mike Tyson, where Larry had been out of the ring for almost 2 years. The point I'm trying to make here is that stopping Larry Holmes inside the distance is no easy task. Yet Foreman had the skills and power that he conceivably could have done it. Foreman likewise was incredibly durable, and he too was only stopped once, in his case over a span of 81 professional bouts. Holmes wasn't a devastating puncher like Foreman. He was more of a sharp puncher whose consistency could wear down opponents with accumulation. Holmes and Foreman were both extremely difficult to stop inside the distance. But if one of these guys were to win by stoppage, Foreman would be the one favored to do so. That's not to say Holmes scoring a stoppage is impossible here, but it seems far less likely. And if Holmes were to stop Foreman, it would almost certainly be late in the fight where he drowned Big George in deep water. Or perhaps something like a freaky cut or something along those lines. But the goal for Larry here isn't scoring a stoppage. It's prolonging the fight as long as possible, where his advantages in speed, skills, athleticism, and stamina have the chance to shine later on. Because with this version of Foreman, he never went more than 10 rounds, whereas this version of Larry had gone the full 15 a bunch of times. Interestingly enough, if you could combine the wisdom Foreman exuded in his 40s with his physical strength and form from his 20s, you might well have the perfect heavyweight fighting machine. But if we're gonna do that, then we have to grant Larry the same wisdom he acquired later in his career. In my mind, it is extremely difficult to pick a winner here. Foreman had the firepower to stop any heavyweight who ever laced them up. Big George at his best was an absolute powerhouse. But the Easton assassin had the skills, the smarts, and the mental toughness required to outgrit Foreman in a battle of attrition. In a head-to-head sense, I would personally favor Foreman and Holmes against most other heavyweights in the history of the division. So who wins between prime George Foreman and prime Larry Holmes? For my official prediction, I believe Larry survives the early onslaught with a few scary moments along the way, possibly even suffering a knockdown, but I think Larry would persevere and out-hustle Foreman late in the contest. I'm going with Larry Holmes by a very close decision in a competitive contest. So I'm taking Larry Holmes by decision, but what the hell do I know? So who do you think would win a dream fight between Prime Big George and a Prime Easton assassin? Please share your thoughts in the comments section. I do intend to do more of these dream fights in the future, and I think this will most likely be the next one in line. But before that, I've been working on a Sugar Ray Robinson piece that I'm hoping to have finished at the end of the month. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and have a wonderful night. This is Rummy's Corner.